Good morning, everybody. My name is Cody Ragsdale, and I will be doing my presentation of my most impactful athlete over Pat Tillman. So, to start off, Patrick, or Pat Daniel Tillman, was born in November 6th of 1976 in San Jose, California. Pat spent most of his time growing up here with his mother, Danny, and then his father, Patrick Sr. Pat also had two brothers, one older brother named Kevin and a younger brother named Richard. Pat unfortunately passed away in April 22nd of 2004 in Spira, Afghanistan, while serving in the U.S. Army. Before this, Pat was married to Mary Ugenti, who was Pat's high school sweetheart. Although they went to different colleges, they stayed faithful to each other throughout the time and were married 4 years after Pat began his NFL career. So, for sports history, Pat spent most of his early childhood playing baseball, and this is actually where he excelled for most of his childhood. It was in 1988 when he was selected for the 11 and 12-year-old All-Star game in his area that he hit a home run and had a diving catch that later on in a diary entry that was read after Pat's passing, this was the ultimate turning point for his athletic career. This is what gave Pat the confidence boost that he needed in order to continue into the athlete that we know him as today. So after this, he still became a baseball standout, through middle school and high school. And so whenever he got to high school, he went and was planning on being on varsity his freshman year, but unfortunately the coach at the time and him did not see eye to eye, and he was told that he would have to play on the freshman and sophomore team. Tillman took this kind of as an insult and made a change over to football. In the year prior, Pat had tried to pick up football, but due to his smaller size, he actually broke his tibia during practice whenever a larger player landed on top of him. Whenever he told the coaches that he would be quitting baseball 100% and going to football full time, they told him that he wouldn't be able to compete. They told him that it was not a good idea and he really needed to reevaluate what he was doing. Pat vowed that he would be able to succeed not only in high school, but would go all the way on to the college level. The coaches at this time really were not fond of this idea, but Pat soon proved himself through not only his speed, but his power and aggressiveness on the field. This earned Pat a full ride to Arizona State University, where he played for 4 years and was an academic All-American with a 3.8 GPA. From his time at Arizona State, he was drafted in the 7th round to the NFL Arizona Cardinals. Pat played for the Arizona Cardinals from 1998 to 2002. The 2001 season was his last season, and he was offered a $9 million contract to go play for the St. Louis Rams at that time. During his time in the NFL, Pat was really known as a frugal guy. He didn't have the flashy cars or the expensive watches, clothes, things like that. He actually rode his bike to practice every day and parked it in the parking lot. He was always kind of poked at because he was parking his bicycle among BMWs and Escalades. At the same time, Pat didn't have a cell phone, and he was very open and honest. In one interview, whenever he was playing for the Cardinals, he was asked, what should people be looking forward to this year from the Cardinals, and he told them nothing. He told them that the Cardinals had not proved themselves and they didn't deserve it. So the turning point of Pat's career after 9/11, 6 months after to be exact, Pat and his brother Kevin made a pact together to enlist. They actually told their mom on Mother's Day of 2020, in 2002, and from then their mother said, "I don't know what I would do if I lost one of my sons," which unfortunately she would have to deal with just years later. So Pat's first tour was in Iraq. He became really the face of American patriotism. it was kind of wondered why Pat would leave this $9 million contract on the table and go serve the country. So while Pat liked his time in the NFL, he felt like he had a larger purpose and went on to the U.S. military. Pat served in the 75th Ranger Battalion with his older brother Kevin. At this time, they met and befriended Russell Bear, who would soon be like another brother to the two. During their time in Iraq, it was said that Pat really disapproved of the war. There was a recollection from a time whenever they were sitting on top of a bunker looking over a town in Iraq, seeing just bombs go off, and Pat really just felt like it was a illegal war. His true quote used some expletives, but he was not open to the public about his disapproval of the war, but it was known within his tight-knit community. So whenever Pat got back, from his first tour in Iraq, he was offered an honorable discharge from the Army. The NFL and the Army, or in the military, met behind closed doors and determined since Pat had completed one tour, he would be eligible to be honorably discharged. However, Pat said he was a man of his word and he committed 3 years, so he was going to serve 3 years. So, whenever Pat got back to his second combat tour, he was shipped out in early April 2004. Unfortunately, on April 22nd of 2004, while on a mission, the team was split up. In this mission, Tillman was split into one group with Russell, and then unfortunately Tillman's brother was in the group behind them that was tasked with staying with the Humvee that was broken down. A little bit went by and the team was ambushed, and Tillman actually turned around from the position that he was in and went back to go help the team that his brother was in. And unfortunately, through some miscommunication, Tillman was killed by friendly fire, along with an Afghani militant force member that was with their team. After his death, it was really shrouded in secrecy for quite some time. So, deception at home. Whenever Pat first died, the media was on Pat's lawn the morning after he died. This kind of turned into a huge campaign, really plastering Pat's face everywhere and trying to stir up some patriotism throughout the states. His wife, Mary, was pressured to have a military funeral with full honors. However, Pat had the slight inclination that this might happen if he just so happened to be killed. This thought came to him while he was in boot camp, and he found a way to smuggle his final intents or final wishes to his wife, Mary, while he was still in basic training. In his final wishes, he asked that he not have a full military funeral. However, whenever the military came and met with Mary, they insisted that he have a funeral at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. However, since Mary did have those papers, she was able to argue it and get it not as large. Pat still had a highly televised funeral, and a lot of this was for the media's sake of kind of making it larger than life, as we'll see later. But during this time, there were politicians that spoke at his funeral and really kind of blew the situation up to be more than it was. At this time, there was still no solid information about Pat's death, but the media turned Pat into a hero, with some accounts of Pat running up the side of a hill into enemy fire to save his teammates. However, now we know that is not true, and this was just a ploy to try and get more American patriotism and support for the war efforts. So, larger than life. Every news outlet, every media outlet picked up Pat's story of heroism. He turned into the new G.I. Joe. He was the face for American patriotism, for what the U.S. government wanted in this backing of the war in Afghanistan. So, during Pat's jersey retirement, there was a video that was played that people started assuming was Pat's, quote, why. And in this video, Pat said he had family members that had served their countries and put their lives on the line, but he hadn't done a damn thing. And so people took this and ran with it. Media outlets gave this the fight argument that this is the morality of why we were there, that in Afghanistan, like, this is what we needed to do. Pat's mom and Pat's family were not very pleased with this because 5 weeks after the funeral, they actually were able to find out. So there was a phone call from the Arizona Republic News to Pat's mom, and she started kind of prying a little bit and got the inclination that the death for Pat may have been friendly fire, and up until this time they had had no information. So after this, Pat's mom really started to do some digging, which she did up until the final court case in 2007. But during this time, there was a lot that was uncovered, and along with a private investigator that was hired, who happened to be a former special operations serviceman, was able to help kind of connect the dots in some of their redacted paperworks and put together the story of what actually happened that day. It was contorted in a way that made it seem like it was completely an accident. However, Pat's mom to this day believes that it was pure negligence and that people were essentially, as she says, just trigger-happy kids. So Pat's dad issued a formal complaint after nothing had been done with Pat's case, and this was taken as a official accusation of criminal conduct by the United States, and this is when the Inspector General office had gotten involved in the Tillman's case. It was determined that General Kinsinger at the time was the one to blame for the mishandling and kind of covering up of information around Pat's death. The family thought that, this case went past a 3-star general and should definitely have went higher. There was a report that was leaked soon after this of basically a memo, a top classified memo that went out, and it went all the way up to the president and the president's speechwriters. During this time, we figured out that a lot more people knew about the possibility that it was friendly fire before Pat's death, or before Pat's memorial even occurred. Even with this, the case was heard in 2007 by the House of Representatives, but unfortunately there was only pushing off of blame by officials that should have been held responsible, and nobody else was held responsible for the actions of covering up Pat's death. In the end, Pat's mom said it's a horrible lie. It's an atrocity that they would take a young man with honorable intentions who served his country and lie about how he died just to promote a war, to use him as a propaganda tool. That's immoral. So we can really see that Pat's mom does not agree with the way that the government is handling the situation, and she would constantly be outspoken about that and would go on to write 2 books throughout her life, and is still advocating for this. So this kind of leads us into our lasting impact of Pat. We have already talked about that he is basically what comes to mind whenever people talk about American patriotism. Somebody who has everything they could ever wish for. Pat had a $9 million NFL contract on the table, and he left it to go serve his country. So he is still the face that people use for patriotism. During the NFL salute to service, his jersey is constantly worn. He is constantly referenced, despite the twisting that occurred to make him more marketable in what happened, rather than acknowledging that it was friendly fire. Many people, including myself, until I started doing research, do not know that Pat was actually killed by U.S. forces. Another good thing, lasting impact that came out of this is the Pat Tillman Foundation that was started by Pat's wife, Mary. She uses this for educational. It's an educational foundation that provides scholarships to kids. One of the kind of negative lasting impacts, one could say, is this instilled a large amount of distrust in the American people. The people that were keeping up with this realized that the government was not to be really trusted with this information, and unfortunately, kind of have to take what they say with a grain of salt. Another lasting impact is that this proved government propaganda through the twisting of these stories. We used Pat's platform, kind of how Pat assumed that it would be carried out before his death while he was in boot camp, and he was portrayed into being something that he was not, and he was essentially turned into a propaganda tool for the government. This story still is kind of used as the masculine source of what real patriotism is. And so, in addition, this kind of gets misconstrued, and it was even retweeted, as you can see on the right side of the screen, by Donald J. Trump during one of the calling for the boycotts for the NFL during Colin Kaepernick's kneeling for the NFL for racial injustices. It's one of those things that, although we know the truth now, many people still neglect to acknowledge what has happened, but nevertheless, it is still a lasting impact, and his face is still a poster child for patriotism in the United States. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.